So thank you everyone for joining the last session of the day. Hard to believe. We're here to talk about reflections on the research process. We've got 3 fantastic presentations, also Discussant. So looking forward to seeing what everyone's been working on. So without further ado, we are going to get into our presentations. We'll follow the order that is just on the program. And let's get started with Joe's presentation. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you so much. Thanks for putting on just an incredible day of conference. I mean, it's just been incredible to hear what people have had to say, and I really appreciate all the hard work that FemQuant put into this. Can I just double check that you can both hear and see this presentation? Hear me, see the presentation. Great, okay, awesome. So I'll try and keep this relatively short so that we have more time for Q&A and everything afterwards. But thank you everyone for coming along, and I know it's been a long day, but hopefully this will be an exciting session. I know I'm excited for the other panelists as well, session presenters as well. So I'll be presenting today on a facet of my PhD research, and I'm looking at capturing relationality, a novel approach to understanding masculinities and sexual and reproductive health. And before I start, I really want to just give kind of credit to, first of all, my incredible team, without whose work this wouldn't be possible. So that's Samuel Lamptey, Nikwate, and Nikwate Laikwate. I want to say thank you to my supervisors, Professor Ernestine Coast, Dr. Tiziana Leone at LSE, and Professor Isman Otupiri at KNUST in Kumasi in Ghana, the Economic and Social Research Council, my glorious funders. And then this also received ethical approval from both the LSE and the Ghana Health Service. And I always like to front load my thanks because I feel like putting it at the end is a disservice to just how integral all of these people have been in making this research possible. So what am I thinking about today? So really the aim of this presentation is to reflect on my attempts to better understand the role of relationality in shaping attitudes and behaviors towards sexual and reproductive healthcare. And when we're thinking beyond the binary variable, this is really trying to push past this construction of both the binary in terms of relationship binaries being partners, and partners are heteronormative, we're talking husband and wife, but also this binary idea of attitudes being static. And in this situation, attempting to re-problematize this constructed binary of pro or anti-abortion. As I said, it's part of a larger PhD project, which aims to explore the relationship between men, masculinity, and sexual and reproductive health in Ghana. And there is a research protocol published as well in BMJ Open, which outlines more of the methods behind this, the decision for a case study context, and the analysis plan. So why am I thinking about this? Particularly, why am I thinking both about men, about sexual and reproductive health, and about data? So we know from evidence that men have a really important role in shaping the conditions under which pregnant people seek abortion-related healthcare. In particular, we know that, for example, things like dominant kind of narratives of masculinities can help shape the normative environment that makes abortion socially acceptable or unacceptable, but also things like the ways that structures, economic, political, social structures are designed and upheld by masculinities means that things like access to finances, to therefore go and access care, are deeply rooted in these kind of very gendered and very patriarchal systems. Now, why does that really matter in terms of the data that we see? Well, for 3 main reasons. First of all, if we look historically, sexual and reproductive healthcare is often considered the domain of cisgendered women. So women whose sex assigned at birth is the same as their gender, or reports to be the same as their gender, who would be cisgendered. For want of a better term, obviously recognizing there are problems within that terminology itself. And that has some historical credence and some saliency. Cisgender women were largely considered the people who would get pregnant, who would suffer the burden of sexual and reproductive healthcare, and therefore were considered to be the most important people to understand the reproductive healthcare behaviors of and to look at fertility. So when we look at data, often what we see is that surveys around sexual and reproductive health are designed to really be geared towards asking these women, women of reproductive age. And I think in particular with this research, I'm here thinking about surveys that we see operationalized in the Global South, often coming from Global North institutions. So what happens and what we see in these surveys is that men are normally most most interesting to researchers and most relevant as partners. And this men as partners rhetoric is really part of this data performativity that we see and this commodity chain that reproduces assumptions. So the men as partners rhetoric really came about in the 1994 International Conference on Population Development about the need to engage men as partners of women in improving sexual and reproductive healthcare. That then became a big part of the data production. Once it became fundable, once it became interesting to policymakers, to programmers, it therefore became of interest to data collectors and researchers, and vice versa. There's that kind of commodity chain that iterates itself and reproduces assumptions. Now, what is the problem with this? Well, who are partners? And often what we see is partners are a very heteronormative construct. We're talking monogamous, we're talking the idea of a man and a woman. And therefore, it really is fitting into a very particular kind of union, a very particular kind of assumption around intimacy and sexual and reproductive health. Moreover, what we've seen in data is this idea that attitudes and behaviors are static and able to be ascribed across partners. So for example, when we look at the demographic and health survey, although there is a way to record whether men have multiple wives, so would be categorized as polygamous, there aren't actually questions later on around behaviors that reflect the fact that behaviors could be different for different relations, for different partners. And therefore we have to make certain assumptions in the use of these data. Often what we see researchers doing is removing polygamous couples, which means that those women will be absolutely erased from data sets. Or we see that there is an assumption that those attitudes and behaviors will be held static across partners. And this for me is something that really needs to be problematized more. So an example that we have here, and look, and I don't want to chat rubbish about the demographic and health survey. It's an incredible data tool and it's been incredibly important for anyone researching global health. But I'm hoping here we can think about sort of pushing the conversation forward. So this question in the DHS is, as you can see, in your opinion, is a husband justified in hitting or beating his wife in the following situations? Already we see that assumption, husband-wife. So there is no form of other relationality that we might see here. We also see yes, no, don't know. That implies that we have the ability to have these very static, very rigid views. So in this research, which is a case study in Jamestown in Accra in Ghana, we used a mixed methods, respondent-driven sample-based survey and nested in-depth interviews using mobile phones, which was in response to COVID-19, making sure that it was secure and safe. And through abductive thematic analysis of the qualitative data and weighted cross-tabulations in our studio of the quantitative data, I analyzed what significance the design of our survey had. So in our survey, what we did was we allowed men, so the survey was men over the age of 18, anyone who says they're a man. We didn't actually require any evidence. We just asked, how would you describe yourself? If they said a man, they would be included. And what we did was for the relation type, we asked men in an open-ended question, could you describe if you're in a relationship, what that is in your own words? And then we kept asking that until they said that that was the end of their relationship history. So for example, we would ask if there was anyone else. And so men could then answer if they had other forms of intimate relationships, as well as their initial answer. Then for all of the behavioral questions, we then made sure that these linked back to each partner separately. So where men were asked, would you support your current partner obtain an abortion? This was using their own language repeated for each partner. So if a man described having a wife and then a girlfriend and then a side chick, the survey would be iterated to make sure we asked, would you support your wife obtain an abortion? Would you support your girlfriend obtain an abortion? Would you support your side chick obtain an abortion? So as you can see, this is what we did here, and we kept repeating for all the relationships. We also had a grid. Would you support the following to obtain an abortion if they wanted one? Now, this grid is not perfect. There are lots of people who might not be included, and this is a very heteronormative grid, as you can probably see. that reflected during some workshops the construction of the different types of relations of women that men were most likely to identify as having. So this was trying to be iterated and context specific to the study site through workshops, through iteration, through cognitive testing with a sample of men from a nearby community that was comparable to the community that we were sampling in. And we had here, yes, no, don't know, it depends. And because we were doing this over mobile phones with laptop technology, we could also write in more answers. So 296 men responded to the survey and 37 responded to the interview. The majority of respondents in both had attained a kind of middle to secondary school level education. Most were in a relationship, and around sort of just under half were parenting or caring for children or loved ones or dependents in the style of a father, because we were aware that constructions of fatherhood are contextual and that it is not simply about biology when we talk about parenting and fathering. So from the qualitative interviews, we can see immediately that there is absolutely this idea of relationality. From these two quotes, which are indicative of a lot of the quotes that we saw, a lot of the themes that we saw emerging, was this sense of abortions aren't inherently good or bad, it really depends on the context. The first quote we see here, the respondent ends by saying, if you make the lady his wife, there is no need for an abortion. So an abortion is acceptable if marriage is on the cards, if this idea of wife or equivalent is on the cards. If not, it changes the relationship with abortion. We see this other man talk about if you have sex with someone on the streets who's not necessarily the woman that you are in an intimate partnership with, you must tell that lady to go and abort the child. But it is your relationship with that lady that drives that response. So, can we see that in the quantitative data? Is that possible to capture? Well, first of all, what we saw was that of those who answered they had multiple partners, 22 out of 28 had the same opinion towards all of their current partners having an abortion. 6 had different incongruous opinions, so it was different depending on who the partner was. Of 16 of the 49 men who reported previously having supported an abortion, so they said in the past they'd either financially supported someone, provided information, taken someone or accompanied someone to a clinic or a provider. Of those 49, only 16 said that they would support a current partner. So immediately we're noticing a few things, that these opinions, these attitudes are really not static, and they are relational, they change over time, and it depends on that link to the current partner. Now, if we go back to the grid, what we found was that 56 of men responded they would not support any of these people obtain an abortion. So, relatively speaking, we can see a relatively high rate of potentially quite anti-abortion views. However, I think it's super important that 44% of men did not have a consistent view towards abortion. So 15% of respondents would support at least one person, or it would depend. So that's yes or it depends. And 29% would support more than one person. You can see here, these were the kind of survey responses we were getting. So wife, it depends, if may cause harm to mum or baby. So that's when they would support depending on the safety, the type of abortion that was provided for. Now, when we did weighted cross tabulations using VH weights, which are responding to the respondent-driven sampling technique we used, we can see really interestingly that these attitudes were also related to men's age. So as you can see, older men were more likely to be supportive, directly supportive of a wife obtaining an abortion compared to younger men. We see here, when it comes to sister, older men again had a much higher rate of it depends. So weren't necessarily saying yes, weren't saying no, but they had these conditions under which they might support someone. The only type of relation where it wasn't included, where there wasn't a difference between ages, was sex workers, which had the largest negative response from all the respondents towards supporting and obtaining an abortion. So what does this tell us? Well, first of all, it tells us if we're thinking about policies and programs to intervene and to engage men around things like sexual and reproductive health, around bodily autonomy, if we construct that around the idea that people's ideologies are driven by a pro or anti-abortion opinion, we're not going to get very far. That binary of pro or anti-abortion simply doesn't reflect the reality. Underneath that, it's about relationships, relationality, age, personal experience. And what I'm finding in the research that we did, it's to do with masculinities and how those things adapt towards men's own views of themselves and of their relations to others. Men really highlighted in this case the pluralities of the relationships and relations that had meaning in their lives. They weren't just partners, they were also fathers, they were brothers, they were friends. And it's essential that we really acknowledge that in our future research. We simply should not have only samples of men who are partners of the women that we're interested in. And I think knowing that these attitudes are not static across the life course is incredibly important. We see in comparable research by Marlowe et al. In North Ghana, that men who were married, older men, had a much more forgiving, and I use forgiving in inverted commas because I think it's a terrible phrase, but were much more likely to consider supporting their wife obtain an abortion because they had seen what a pregnancy was like. And because they were married, they weren't driven necessarily by this ideology of what a marriage should look like, but were more rooted in the realities of what a marriage is. On top of that, they also talked about the embarrassment of being considered the man who couldn't provide, who couldn't control himself, that his wife had got pregnant in an unacceptable manner. But these are all essential because what we really need to think about is breaking down in our surveys, when we have attitudes and behaviors, this binary that those are driven by consistent ideologies, but rather that they are related and relational and situated in an individual's lives. And it really is possible to capture that. I think that's the main thing to try and draw from this kind of novel approach, is that it is possible to capture these and to make these analytically useful for us. Because without these, data will continue to reproduce a lot of the gendered notions about abortion that are increasingly separate from reality. And it's really important when we think about interventions, policies, programming, and engagement, that we have this nuanced data that understands the relationalities, understands the underlying mechanisms behind attitudes and behaviors in order to really try and think about futures of reproductive justice and futures of engagement that really take us to somewhere where we see abortion access, sexual and reproductive health at its most universal, and the rights that we are striving for. So thank you so much for listening. That was a bit of a whistle stop. I went over time, I'm really sorry. And really looking forward to the next presentations.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joe, for kicking us off. Now we will turn, I guess, the microphone over to Laura.
So my name is Laura Sheppard, and I'm delighted to be presenting here today my research, which covers the first year of my PhD, titled Gendering the Research Pipeline. I'm based at the Centre of Advanced Spatial Analysis at UCL, and I just wanted to talk in this presentation today mainly around 2 points. The first is like a gender problem and a diversity problem, and the second is a methods problem. So I will discuss the importance of creating a diverse discipline and sector, which includes diverse voices with a specific focus on gender within academia. And the second will cover the use of using gender inferencing algorithms as a method for assigning gender based on names and the ethical implications of it. So my research is inherently interdisciplinary, and the main fields it covers are gender studies and higher educational inequalities using data science and machine learning. The overarching aim of the research is to understand and examine the gender diversity of UK PhD students over intellectual and geographical space at a departmental, institutional, and disciplinary level. Of course, there are other forms of oppression that persist within academia, such as racism, ableism, homophobia, and ageism. However, this PhD can only really focus on gender due to time and intellectual constraints that a PhD holds. But I am very much acknowledging that it's not just about gender. As highlighted on the titles on the slide, women are systematically underrepresented in academia and face many challenges, including imposter syndrome and cultural sexism. In 2012, only 20% of UK professors were women, and in 2018, only 26% of professors were women. This is much worse when looking at it through an intersectional lens, as only 2.1% of professors identified as female and BAME in 2018. The leaky pipeline is an extensively used metaphor that describes gender and racial differences across the academic career path, especially within science fields. It describes how women are disproportionately affected by the barriers and challenges in academia and either leak out or opt out. Several of the known causes of the leaky pipeline are listed on the slide and include the chilly masculine research climate, a lack of female mentors and role models, and traditional gender roles in society. The UK academic population pipeline is shown on the diagram on the slide, and HEAS data shows that over 57% of the total UK student population identifies as female, whereas 57% at an undergraduate level, 60% at postgraduate taught level, and 49% of PGRs. Therefore, given the backdrop of the leaky pipeline metaphor and the disparities between the numbers of female students and academics, there is a need to examine a crucial part of the academic career path, and that is one of the PhD student. They provide the vital link between students and academics, and more needs to be known about the gender diversity at this level. So UKRI has no long-running data on the personal characteristics of PhD students, as they only fund just under a quarter of PhDs. Therefore, this leads to a data gap, which makes it challenging when it comes to informing policy. This is where Ethos comes in, as it is a full record of UK PhD study. Ethos has over 577,000 PhD records of completed theses and includes data on author name, year of award, thesis title, institution, sometimes department, rarely supervisor, amongst other things. Using Ethos gives me a unique opportunity to investigate the evolution of gender diversity of the PhD students across the UK and over time. As Ethos has no data on the gender of PhD students, I needed a way of finding this information out. Therefore, gender inferencing algorithms were needed. The dataset is too large to approach everyone individually and ask them to self-identify their gender, although of course this would be the preferred way to do it. Gender inferencing algorithms use a database of name to gender combinations and the frequency at which they occur to predict the likelihood a name is female, male, or unknown. But of course, there are more genders than this. For this PhD research, I'm using the 5 gender inferencing algorithms shown on the slide. There are many different services that can be used. Some are free, some are paid for, some are more accurate than others. Some take surnames and a cultural context into account when predicting gender. Some are better at predicting non-Western names than others. There are ethical issues associated with using gender inferencing algorithms that need to be addressed. As the gender binary variable is the theme of the conference, it will be discussed in more detail on the next slide. So first, labeling Asian names as unknown. The accuracy of current gender inferencing algorithms is a source of contention, as depending upon the data used to infer names, certain names are not recognized, and this is especially noted with Asian names. When Karami et al. Compared packages such as Gender, Sex Machine, and Genderize for their accuracy, they found that the error rates were dependent upon the country of residence, with names in North American and European countries having lower rates when compared to Asian countries. Asian names are less common in training datasets, which is a form of algorithmic bias. All gender inferencing services are seen to perform at least one order of magnitude better on European names than Asian names. And this is bad in present-day academia, as there is a large share of Asian academics. This area needs improvement in order to address all aspects of algorithmic unfairness and bias present within gender inferencing algorithms. The risks of cumulative false positives and false negatives significantly alter our understanding at a departmental and institutional context, which is not inconsequential. To minimize the risks of false positives and false negatives, I will combine the gender inferencing algorithms, each with their own benefits and drawbacks, and pool the results. By combining the results, I will hopefully reduce the errors and that 5 algorithms give a better prediction than 1. So the gendered assumptions of the rigid 2-gender binary of male and female is reinforced through all gender inferencing services. It dismisses the experience of transgender and non-binary people whose gender identity is not simply male or female. It also fails to include intersex people within it, and as they form 1.7% of the population, this is a large section of society. Their identities are not regarded and often not acknowledged during research and data collection. Every analysis bears the risk of reinforcing gender stereotypes and gender binary models, which risks misgendering people, and is important to take this into consideration. Of course, gender differences within academic fields need to be examined and understood. However, there is a fine line between analysing gender inequalities and reinforcing gender as a category. During the creation of my validation dataset, we found at least 2 people out of approximately 2,000 who did not identify as female or male and used they them pronouns. Therefore, all the gender influencing algorithms would automatically misgender these 2 people in ethos. As it's obviously only a small sample of ethos, which is over 500,000 records, there are likely to be a lot more non-binary and gender non-conforming people in ethos who will always be misgendered. So the next part of the presentation looks at the methods I've been using in the first year and hope to build on. So at QStep, Intern and I took a sample of 2,375 names from ethos to create a validation dataset. The sampling was based upon the frequency of the names and in ethos, and it included very common names as well as rarer names. This validation dataset was used to test bias and holes within gender inferencing algorithms predictions. The intern validated the names by a Google search and used markers like pronouns and titles on LinkedIn or Twitter or on institutional websites to infer an individual's gender in the validation dataset. It was then combined with another validation data of 7,076 names to create a total validation data of 9,451 names. So the results. An example of the accuracy of NAMSOR, which is one of the algorithms I've been using, is shown on the confusion matrix on the slide. The x-axis shows manual gender from the validation dataset, and the x shows NAMSOR's predictions. The darker purple boxes show how many names were predicted correctly by NAMSOR. The results of the confusion matrices suggest NAMSOR and Gender API are the most accurate. And as NAMSOR is the only algorithm that uses surnames to give a cultural context to the first name automatically, this is like a big selling point of using it. Gender API has a wide-reaching training data set that includes names from 189 countries and has a total of 6 million names in its databases. Gender R and Gender Guesser are of a similar accuracy, approximately 13 to 14% lower than Gender API and NAMSOR. And these results were unsurprising given previous findings. And those two are available for free on Python and R. Next, I used Ensemble Methods. So Ensemble Methods involve combining the results of several models and outcomes in order to reduce the errors for each individual model. It is hoped that multiple algorithms will give better gender prediction than simply using one. Logistic regression, random forest, and Gaussian naive Bayes models were fitted against the training data from our combined validation dataset. Each model was given information on the algorithm's gender predictions and modeled on the testing data. We then looked at how they performed on the testing data, and subsequently a voting classifier Ensemble was fitted on top of the three models to combine their results. And this was my first attempt at Ensemble Methods on the data. The results of the combined Ensemble, the voting classifier, had an accuracy-like score on the testing data of 82.5%. Individually, the logistic regression scored best on the testing data at 82.5% as well. When additional naming characteristics, such as the length of first names and the endings of first names, were added to the algorithm's predictions, it made the results worse, and the voting classifier's accuracy on the testing data reduced to 79.1%. The first Ensemble was not a significant improvement on the predictions of using individual algorithms such as NAMSOR and Gender API. However, what is not known is how the algorithms performed on different types of names. These Ensemble learning models will be improved and refined in order to predict the gender of names with the most accuracy. And the final method I've been using is multi-level modeling. So multi-level modeling is a widely used method within quantitative geography, and it can be used to understand at which geographical scale and the variation in social patterns lies, which is ideal for this research. The graph on the slide shows which larger fields the students were in from my small sample of ethos, And the largest numbers were in technology, the natural sciences, and the social sciences, as well as the NA category for having no Dewey Decimal Classification, which defines disciplines within ethos. I ran the multi-level model on the small sample of ethos and had 3 hierarchical levels: departmental, institutional, and disciplinary, and the residual variance was split between the 3. The largest variation in the gender of PhD students occurred at the disciplinary scale. So, as I've stated before, unfortunately, we only have the gender in as a binary sex variable. But when assessing the individual variance for disciplines, the disciplines that were above the mean in the number of female PhD students included library and information sciences, English and sociology and anthropology. Despite only being a small sample, these results do echo previous literature, as subjects like psychology and the social sciences are known to be more female dominated. The disciplines that are below the mean for the number of female PhD students included physics, computer science, and engineering. And like the top female disciplines, these results were unsurprising to me, as it is widely reported in the literature that some subjects are more male dominated. This multi-level model is obviously only a preliminary investigation into the type of models it would be appropriate to use going forward. And obviously, as it's such a small sample of ethos, there's a lot of uncertainty at the institutional scale. However, the institutions with an overall imbalance in the gender diversity of their PhD population, with a variance above and below the mean share, are shown on the slide. Oxford, Essex, and Leicester were below the mean, and Goldsmith, Warwick, and Aberdeen were above. The variation at the departmental level in this sample is fairly meaningless. However, the results from the first model show the kinds of applications we could have later on. And finally, to summarize the presentation. The main points from my talk are listed on the slide and include the importance of using caution when using gender inferencing services and being aware of their limitations. It is crucial to consider the ethical implications, like reinforcing the gender binary, misgendering people, and the biases in the training data, which mean Asian names are more likely to be mislabeled than European names. Of course, there is a need for gender inferencing algorithms to expand their training data beyond simply male and female names to include names in their data for non-binary and gender fluid identities, because otherwise people will continue to be misgendered and biases in the data will continue to persist, and the rigid, non-inclusive gender binary will continue to be enforced whilst using gender inferencing algorithms. Gender API and NAMSOR are the most accurate gender inferencing services for predicting the gender from names, whereas Gender R and Gender Guesser were the least. The results of the preliminary models show English and social sciences, physics and engineering to be the disciplines that were furthest away from the mean levels of gender diversity, the former being female dominated at the PhD level and the latter two being male dominated at the PhD level. It'll be interesting to see if these results hold when I use a multi-level model is run on the larger sample of ethos. Thank you for listening to my talk, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura, for sharing your work. We'll now turn to our third panelist, Alexis.
Great, thank you. So this is the last presentation on the last presentation on the last panel. So we'll have some themes here that I think are similar to what we've heard throughout the day. But I wanted to bring a little bit of an international relations perspective into the conversation today. And so what this presentation is really trying to do is sort of take stock of where we are at about 25 years of trying to gather gender disaggregated data at the international level on things related to security and development. So in case I don't get time, a couple of takeaways here. So I make the argument, and again, this is part of a larger project on gender and technology and international relations, but I try and make the argument in this particular piece of the project that coinciding norms around big data and gender disaggregated data have combined to produce some reductive outcomes, especially related to data on gender as it relates to security and development. Furthermore, existing efforts to quantify gendered security, inequality, etc., continue to struggle with multiple issues, including ethical, mathematical, and conceptual issues. And critical perspectives on political science and data science, including some that we've heard today in the course of this conference, can really potentially point us towards what I argue should be a second generation approach in data collection and reporting surrounding these issues. So just to talk about those two emerging norms, and I think, this is something that we've heard alluded to a lot today in the various panels. On the one hand, we have these norms that have emerged in the past 20 to 25 years surrounding the idea of big data, which is that more data which can be produced, shared, and analyzed more quickly is a net good, even if that sometimes runs into issues related to ethics and consent. These big data norms are really intertwined with technology, especially in terms of the anticipation of computational processing of the data, which is why I refer to big data as a technology. And then quantification is prioritized as part of that as well. So I sort of talk about the timeline of the emergence of these norms surrounding big data and how they really kind of coincide with the notion of prioritizing gender disaggregated data. So in particular, this begins in the 1990s with mandates from the United Nations and other international organizations. Gender disaggregated data is also seen as being a normative good, but there is a prioritization of translating gender disaggregated data as data about women, which becomes problematic. Likewise, there is a priority placed on measuring data that aligns with international goals, in particular the Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals, which I'll mention as I go on. And so there's really an expectation that gender disaggregated data will continue into the future, but we can talk about what form that will take. In terms of discussing the issues surrounding the data that we have, I sort of break it down into a few different categories. First of all, conceptually, we can think about who measures data on gender equality and security, and the answer is very often elite institutions. So for anyone who heard the discussion about the data feminism book a little earlier, one of the things that really resonated with me from that book is the notion that producing data is not free. This entails a lot of money and resources. And so the data that's produced tends to come primarily from international institutions, but also from well-funded research institutes or academics. That raises questions of elite bias and Western bias in some of the measurements that we have. Similarly, there's a question of what they're measuring. And so as I mentioned a moment ago, on the one hand, gender disaggregated often ends up getting translated to mean data about women, which is problematic because as we heard, I think earlier in this panel, there's a lot to be learned from collecting data about men as well. There tends to be a tendency alongside that to ignore the status and experiences of any non-binary populations. So we've talked a lot in the course of this workshop about LGBTQ populations, but also looking at the international context, there are many non-binary populations that have either legal or culturally recognized status in different parts of the world whose experiences tend to be ignored by current data. The final point here is that outcomes also tend to be strongly tied to international goals. So for example, the Millennium Development Goals, which come about in the year 2000, placed a priority on increasing access to universal primary education for girls. And so in the Millennium Development Goals period between the year 2000 and about the year 2015, you see a tremendous increase in data collected on just women's access to primary education, but not the same amount of data being collected on access to secondary or tertiary education. Similarly, concept validity is low, so I'll get to comparing some of the indices we have in a moment. Mathematical issues, just to kind of touch on this briefly, of course, in the international context, we often see that there's a problem of non-random missing data. So states that are less likely to report or to report consistently and reliably on indicators related to gender tend to be conflict-affected states, small states, and states that are going through government transitions. So there's a non-random missing effect there. I'll get to the weighting of indices in a moment, but there's an argument that some of the indexes that people have tried to make that combine multiple measures of gender equality or security have some issues in terms of how they're weighting that potentially affect outcomes. Over and under inclusive indices. So when we are trying to make an indicator that combines multiple indicators that might hint at gendered security or development, how do we know what to include, how much to include? Some indices combine as many as in excess of 30 component measures, which potentially raises questions about over-inclusion as well. And then, of course, there's the limited utility of simple scales that try to measure aspects of gender equality on trichotomous or simple ordinal levels. And the other thing to keep in mind is that much of this data is not longitudinal in nature. So much of the data collection we've had surrounding the status of women internationally or cross-nationally only has at most a 20 to 25 year history, some indicators even less than that. So if we're trying to make meaningful studies of progress, there is also really not longitudinal comparison points to introduce here. And then finally, perhaps most relevant to the discussions we're having today is this notion of ethical issues. So I've already touched on the operationalization of gender disaggregated data to mean data about women. Not only is that methodologically a problem because we don't have a comparison population, but it also, it excludes populations that we may actually be interested in seeing. There's a concern about, masking privilege when we exclude men from some of these measures. There's also the potential to, again, as I mentioned, exclude a lot of non-binary or transgender populations whose experiences matter if we're taking gender as our framework for analysis. Western and elite biases in operationalizing terms about equality and security are a problem. Education is one potential example of that. So we've gone from having a strong emphasis on measuring things like universal access to primary education to now having some indices of gender equality that include measures like the number of women in a country that have master's degrees or PhDs. And so there's really a conceptual question in terms of where we decide what equality and inclusion look like. And is it meaningful to have something like a statistic on how many women in a country have a master's degree if you don't have a comparative statistic for men? And thinking about developing countries, that number in many cases will be low for all genders. Lack of intersectional understanding. So again, I discuss a little bit in the paper about the fact that there are some indices that include indicators of women's status that are also explicitly racialized, like in the case of the United States maternal mortality. And that's usually acknowledged in a qualitative assessment, but is harder to account for in quantitative measures as well. And then a final ethical point is, the interesting point about resistance to quantification amongst populations. So one thing that I haven't heard brought up a lot in the context of our discussions today is the notion of surveillance, but there are really some problematic relations in the past, especially when we look at indigenous populations, racial or ethnic minorities, and LGBTQ communities in different countries that have had the historical experience of data collection being used to surveil and control. And so if those populations continue to want to resist quantification, I think we need to think more about the ways that that can be pursued as a solution. Quick table here, but I just used a quick case study in the paper of the United States just to show the difficulty of actually trying to meaningfully compare these measures. And if the table looks kind of messy, it's because it is messy. Some of these indices that are being produced are simple scales from 0 to 7 or 1 to 4. Some are more complex indices that are sort of a continuous variable. What I thought was interesting in the case of the United States was that you can see I tried to make a comparison of kind of cohort validity here. And you can see that depending on which indicator you're looking at, the United States can either fall alongside countries like France or Ireland, or it can fall alongside countries like North Korea and Saudi Arabia. So I argue that this is kind of evidence pointing to the fact that there may be a need to think through some of these indicators, especially when we're thinking about how to operationalize things like inclusion or equality, breaking down some of these indices a little further, which I don't necessarily know that I'll have time for. Some of these indicators, I argue, are really just using economic development as a proxy for the status of women, which is problematic. Some of them are also using, for example, the Women's Stats Multivariate Scale 5 purports to be a measure of the strength of national laws related to gender equality. But in fact, what is weighted most heavily in that is ratification of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is an international treaty. So again, just to point to some conceptual issues there. So in the interest of time, I'll just wrap up with a couple of things. So conceptually, we can see that existing measures produce very divergent results that can place the same country at the top or bottom of a scale, depending on where you're looking. Mathematically, some of the measures are impacted by questionable weighting among component variables, and there also seems to be little variability on some measures. So on some of the scales on the slide I just mentioned, you might have as many as 62 countries that have the same measure, in which case is arguably not a terribly useful variable. Ethically, these measures, I argue, mask racial differentials on component indicators. They tend to omit the experiences of men and transgender or non-binary population. And there's also a potential concern about elite biases in their definitions. And then just where I'll kind of leave off is to talk about, where this might be leading us towards a second generation approach to collecting data on these issues. So I argue that there is a need to move gender disaggregated data beyond just being data on women to sort of offer insight into a wider range of experience and also comparative populations. I point out some projects that place an emphasis on mixed methods approach, like the Women's Stats Project, which tries to combine qualitative and quantitative information in a way that provides a richer user experience. But one thing that we heard earlier on in the workshop today, I think, was about the importance of including targeted groups and actually making them stakeholders in concept formation. So very often these indices are being created by academics or practitioners, again, at elite institutions. But I argue that there's potentially more of a need to, include constituent populations in different parts of the world in providing a voice in, what inclusion or equality or security might look like to them. Building capacity beyond data extractivism. This is something that I, again, have to acknowledge the Data Feminism project and book for talking about. There's also a great literature out there on Indigenous statistics, which is worth looking into, that talks about the need to kind of move beyond just, making these populations something we count towards actually building capacity, again, making them stakeholders and making them participants in their own data collection processes. And then finally, from a methodological approach, it would be great if we could see some investment into forensic efforts to expand the timeline, especially in the context of quantitative research on international relations. Having data that goes beyond just the past 20 to 25 years related to the status of women is really important to being able to make arguments about how experiences within a population have changed over time. So I believe I'm at time. I'll just end there, but you're welcome to follow me, and I'll look forward to any questions about the research going forward.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Alexis, and thank you to all our panelists for contributing today. I'd like to turn the floor over to Lena, who is our discussant for the panel.
Yes, thank you very much for these 3 great presentations, and I was really happy to be assigned the role of discussant of this specific session or panel, because this is really interesting questions, and to reflect on the research process is so important for all of us. And I just have one slide, and I think that reflecting on your work, there are 3 common themes that also have been discussed in other panels during the day. But the first theme or question is, can the inclusion of a binary oversimplified measure of gender sometimes do more harm than good? Second, how can we as scholars include checkpoints in the research process? First, regarding our own research, but then second, also when we are asked to review other scholars' work. And 3, how can we as scholars hold on to good academic standards when powerful and resourceful international organizations seem to just add women and stir without much reflection? And perhaps I also think that you discuss, or the papers lead to discussion on research as an individual process and research as a collective process. And I will give some brief preliminary answers to these questions myself before turning to the different papers and give some more specific comments on the different papers. Especially listening to the last presentation here, I've become a bit unsure, but I still think that most of the time the inclusion of binary gender categories, if previously absent in the research area, is for the better, both for research but also policy making. I think that all of us attending to this workshop know that there are so many political and social processes that affect women in ways different from men. And if gender is totally excluded, there's a risk that the male perspective will be dominant. And perhaps I'm coming from a different generation. I started my PhD program in early 1990s, and my focus was on women's representation in the Swedish parliament. And I was told by almost all male colleagues that, well, gender is not important. What's important in this area is political ideology, party affiliation, etc., etc. But still, they had included a gender category in all service. So I was able to check, well, is gender important or not? And of course, I found that gender was much more important than was previously understood in this research area. And perhaps I tend to see this as a historical process. It is very, very hard to imagine the introduction of more nuanced gender measures without a previous history of categorical gender measures. But then going to the second question, how then can we as scholars include checkpoints in the research process? And most of us that participate in this workshop, and this is especially for the presenters in these panels, we already have awareness regarding the complexities of sex and gender and how this is constructed in relationships. But also for us, I think that it's very important that we ask ourselves some critical basic questions. What did we, the research community, learn from the exercise that we previously did not know if we include more nuanced gender measures? And the second question, why should we, the research community, trust these new findings coming out of more nuanced measures? How stable are these results? But perhaps even more important to point out in this panel is the need to be careful in the reflection of other scholars' work. Alexis Henshaw talked a lot about the second generation of measuring gender, and I think that this concept is very useful, but we also need to look at some disciplines within different research areas. And this was mentioned not in the presentation, but in the paper from Alexis Henshaw. And this research comes from my own department, and it's on gender and diplomacy. And I know that these scholars have a kind of simple or oversimplified gender measures, but this is because no one else has really done large end studies on gender diplomacy previously, so they need to start somewhere. And when we reflect on other scholars' work, I think that we should ask ourselves, so what was the main finding in this research area when it comes to gender previously? And also evaluate the new research. Did they add anything of importance, even if they were using, a bit simplified gender categories? And then the third question, how to stick to good academic standards when international organizations are keen to just add women and stir in an untheoretical, non-reflective way. Yeah, I think that one of the most important roles for academic scholars is to be a corrective, to say when this is relevant, that the role of gender might be overstated or built on false premises. This is one of our important topics for us as gender scholars, to say when gender is important and when it's not. And I see this a lot in my own research on the link between gender and corruption, where international organizations is overemphasizing the role of gender and present women as an anti-corruption force in a very simplistic way. And I try to join when international organizations invite me to conferences, workshops, or in other ways comment on the work. And then I see my role as a corrective. No, gender is not important in the way that you think. Women should not be added as stir and used as an anti-corruption force. And these were some general reflections, and I will try to make some comments also on the different papers. And starting with the paper from Joe Strong, I think that this is great work. And this paper really made me think that the misunderstandings on the role of men in sexual and reproductive health might actually do more harm than good. And you manage not only to problematize the gender male category, but also how scholars measure attitudes towards abortion. And I think that one very important result coming out of your research is that older men are the ones most accepting of abortion. I think that most tend to think that younger generations are the most pro-gender equal generations, but you are definitely showing something differently, that older men, based on their life experiences, tend to have a more allowing attitude when it comes to abortion. And moving forward, I was thinking that it would be interesting to do more qualitative research, trying to understand whether those attitudes are tied to abortion, or whether you can see a pattern relating to women's issues, women's rights more generally. Because I thought that some of the answers seem to be like men controlling women more generally, or is it abortion more concretely, if you see what I mean? I think that would be very interesting. And my other reflection was that it would be interesting to include not only questions about relationships to women, but also questions on the circumstances under which women became pregnant, but perhaps you also have this in the survey. Does it matter if a woman becomes pregnant after rape, or does it make a difference if the woman is lacking emotional or economic support during pregnancy? But I think this is really great work. But I was really upset by some of the quotes in your qualitative work, and it would be interesting to see if you would get the same results doing research also in other countries, like in the US or other countries where there tend to be large portion of the population that are anti-abortion, have strong anti-abortion attitudes. When it comes to the paper or presentation from Laura Sheppard, I think that those algorithms are truly fascinating, and you show great awareness about the strengths, but also limitations regarding these technologies. And one question that came to my mind reading your paper is what the possibilities are to use these methods in comparative research. Are there some languages where names are more or less gender typical, for example? And I think that in Sweden, names are a bit more gender typical than the English names, but is this an easy way to be able to digest a large number of data also in other countries? And what is your reflection on that? And moving forward, I think it would be really interesting if you could tie your data also to other types of data. Would it be possible to do similar research when it comes to publications in order to get closer to these informal male networks? So when it comes to co-authoring, etc., could you use this on Google Scholar, JSTOR, and those kind of websites? And then I think it would be really, really interesting. And especially since you have this pipeline idea and compare thesis to other stages in the academic process, I think that would be great work. And then finally, the paper from Alexis Henshaw. I think this is a very interesting discussion on the harm that data collection sometimes can do. And all of us working with quantitative data need to reflect on this all the time. I have not seen that much data where disaggregated data means only women data, where so I was not aware of any big data collections at the moment that only include women. I thought that most the big data collection actually included also data from men, but perhaps I'm most misinformed here. But one thing I wasn't really sure about your view here. I think the research needs to start somewhere. So if there's no gender category at all, then I would suggest any scholar to at least include a simple binary gender category, because it can be used in secondary analysis where scholars have a more theoretical informed attitude towards gender. And I was also, this is more in the paper than in your presentation, that you were discussing whether gender scholars should avoid citing other scholars' work where gender is used in a very flawed, very non-reflective way. And perhaps I'm a bit scared of building research silos where there is no communication. I mean, even if the gender category is handled in a bad way, there can be other qualities in this kind of research. And yes, I'm a bit conscious or cautious when it comes to excluding research, even though if the gender category is not handled in a very good way, because I'm so scared of building silos. I think that we need to communicate with each other and be able to make an impact also on mainstream research. And I guess that I think that thinking of research as a collective process, perhaps sometimes you need to do a division of work here. I very much agree that we need to listen to affected groups and be very sensitive to the groups that we do research on. But I'd also think that some gender scholars need to be able to build bridges into the mainstream research. And this is the other side of the roles that we as gender scholars have. And this is a tricky question, but we both need to be sensitive to affected groups and try to do work that build bridges into mainstream research. But thank you so much, and I really enjoyed reading all this paper because you raised so important questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lena, for your thoughtful engagement with the papers and asking some questions that I think we all here can take away. But I would also like to give a very short opportunity for the panelists to respond to the discussant questions or comments or what have you. So if each panelist is interested, you have a tiny little minute to do so. Otherwise, we'll move into Q&A. So I guess we'll go in order. Joe, would you like to respond or anything?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Lena, for that amazing discussant role. I don't know what the word is. I'm losing my English at this time of day. Yes, is there more general control, or is it abortion specifically? Is a really good question. We do have the data in the survey around other aspects of sexual and reproductive health and fertility. So we can certainly broaden it out. And what we find is that abortion does have some unique qualities, but it is very much rooted in something bigger, which is this kind of, in my findings, my theory, my push forward is it's rooted in masculinities. And controlling the reproductive body is a huge integral part of being able to fulfill masculine ideals among certain men. So I think there's an element of, yes, this is broader control, but that broader control is still rooted in reproduction. It's still rooted in controlling fertility. And part of that is to fulfill masculine ideals. Now on the relationships and circumstances, really interesting question. We kept that a little bit more blank because we wanted men to offer if they had these circumstances. We really wanted to keep it a very kind of low-key, generative, exploratory survey in its design. But I totally agree with you. The qualitative, there is so much more there in the qualitative work around these nuances of what are the conditions, what are the circumstances under which someone is pregnant. But what we did find often is that men tended to really insert themselves without necessarily, as you see around the world, without necessarily considering the pregnant person themselves and their own circumstances. It's much more rooted in men's circumstances. But thank you so much for your thoughts. I've got loads of notes and it's so helpful. So yeah, thank you so much.
Great. Laura, would you like to take a moment to respond as well?
Yeah, no, I was going to say thanks as well, because I feel like all the points you made were quite relevant to like all three of us. So it's actually really useful having outside perspective. Just a couple of points that you said about looking at applying it to publications, and actually that's been really widely done. So there's a lot of research out there that has looked at like women in academia and, you know, their co-authorships, their citations, like their networks, and like, so that's really extensively looked at, especially in STEM. Whereas the reasons for sort of applying this onto like PhD students is purely because it hasn't really been done, and Ethos is a great resource for that. So like that, yeah. So it's sort of adding to what's already there. And also in terms of like other languages and stuff, I'm not 100% on that, because obviously mine is all in, well, Latin script, like alphabet, and in English, but like some of the algorithms, one particularly NAMSL, which I spoke about, does use different alphabets, and I think it looks at different languages as well. So like so it does sort of take that into account, like when you're saying about Swedish names, for example. But I don't know if that really, I don't know more than that sort of on it, because they're quite Eurocentric and like North American centric, really, like English centric, unfortunately.
Great. And Alexis, would you like to have an opportunity to just, sorry, I don't know where my words are either, react to the discussant comments?
Yeah, thank you. So I appreciate it. This was about 12,000 words worth of work that I kind of pared down into 2,000 for the review. So, you know, I apologize if some of the arguments maybe didn't come across really clearly. You know, one of the points that I wanted to make as well is that, you know, I sort of stressed in the work that, you know, I was not trying to discount the effort of scholars who put together the data projects that I envisioned, but the idea is that, you know, especially over the past 20 to 25 years, a lot of this data collection has been centered around particular institutional goals. And so there has been a pressure to place emphasis on certain indicators and to also, you know, show some outcomes related to that as well. The argument is that moving forward, perhaps we can use that as a justification for getting more resources to make data a little bit more complex, a little bit more intersectional, and build out some of those connections that haven't occurred before. more. Some of the indices that I covered in the presentation actually do only cover the experience of women, and so there is no comparative data on the male population to go along with that. So again, I do still think that that's a methodological issue, but also in regards to the citing debate, but I wanted to make it clear that that was not my argument that we should not be citing research across the area, but I bring that in because it is a disciplinary conversation that has been happening in political science, and especially in feminist international relations, that I, to some extent, am still thinking through myself.
I would love to continue discussing this for a lot longer than we have, and unfortunately we have run out of time for the session. So I want to take this opportunity to thank all of our panelists as well as our discussant for a really interesting set of presentations, and I think lots of interesting things that we can come away from as we reflect on our own research processes and what do the questions that were brought up in this session, as well as the conference overall, what does that mean for the work that we do going forward? Also want to thank all of our panelists today, all of our discussants today. This was an even better event than I think any of us had hoped for, and we were so pleased with the results. Thank you also to CRASSH at the University of Cambridge for all your support, financial and logistical, and hosting the event and making it all possible and turning it into a reality. And thank you also to our audience today. We had such a great turnout, so many good questions, lots of fun stuff. So thank you everyone for your part in making today such a success. If you're interested in what else FemQuant is up to, we actually have a monthly seminar series. It's kicking back up in October, so keep an eye out for that. If you want to know more, you can join our listserv. Just feel free to email one of us about that or follow us along on Twitter, and be sure to check out our blog as well, where we like to feature new and upcoming research in this area. So once again, thank you everyone for being a part of today. Thank you to our panelists for such great presentations and our discussants, and have a great day, everyone. Take care.